The History of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi, Chapter 2, The Break with the Past. The new age is like lightning, inflammatory is every haystack. Neither wilderness nor garden is immune from its attack. To this new flame, old nations are like faggots on a pyre. Followers of the last messenger are consumed in its fire. Even today, if Abraham's faith could be made to glow, out of Nimrod's fire a garden of flowers would grow. Muhammad Iqbal, Jawab-e-Shikwa. The break from the past experienced in the largest part of the Muslim world led to profound consequences both at the individual and social levels. The challenge of the Western dominance was not to be met through affirmation of the precepts of traditional civilization expected to create a gateway into modernity. The weight of apologetic and defensive literature stressing Islam's rationality and its support for scientific inquiry might indicate otherwise, but this was more of an implicit admission of the failures of Islamic civilization to provide an entry into the modern world, as understood in European terms, and therefore to provide the essential access to wealth and power in order to confront the expansion of European empires. From now on, the division of the world of Islam between the reformers and the secularists and Westerners became sealed. The former sought to maintain a pivotal role for Islam in society, while the latter pushed towards restricting Islam's influence to private spheres in a secularized and modernized society. From the mid 19th century right to the present times, the division has not really shifted in structure and has dominated the intellectual landscape of Islamic societies. The proponents of the traditional Islam, reduced as they were to defending an ever shrinking private space, were left behind, abandoned to individual piety and family bonds, while the outer manifestations of traditional Islam were being systematically demolished. By the beginning of the 20th century, within less than 50 years, the institutions of traditional Islamic society and polity had virtually disappeared in content, if not quite yet in form. The collapse of confidence. Why did most of the leaders and elites of a great civilization so quickly reject the possibilities of adjustments to modernity, which may have been inherent in their own world? The reality of physical conquest is naturally one explanation, but this did not affect the entire Muslim world at the same time and to the same extent. Nevertheless, the dismantling of the Mughal state in India, for example, even in its final decrepit form, eliminated in one stroke an entire administrative and judicial class that had been organized, for better or worse, under a traditional form. In Algeria, of course, the extent of physical conquest was far more reaching, as it led to the absorption of the country into the system of metropolitan France, the seizure of domains of Islam from their historical guardians, and the loss of access to the state power and patronage greatly contributed to the alienation and powerlessness of those still steeped in traditional ways. A premium was thus placed on those who could adjust to the ways and perspectives of the conqueror. Some of the former elites adapted quickly and became the foremost proponents of secularization, not as a way of restoring Muslim power as much as a necessary precondition to joining the comity of modern states and nation. Military defeat and physical occupation initially engender a state of introspection rather than one of resistance, especially where there is a massive disparity in power between the contestants and limited access to the tools of resistance. The prospects for removing the occupier appear remote and breed a sense of helplessness. The virtues and methods of the occupier become exaggerated while the alternative be it the traditional way or active resistance, appear to lead to marginalization, lack of potency, and destruction. European civilization dazzled a large number of visitors from what was then known as the Orient. They could not help but compare and contrast what they witnessed to conditions in their own society. The stream of visitors and sojourners, such as the Egyptian Rifa al-Tahwitawi, who spent years between 1826 to 1831 in Paris, or Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who spent a year in England in 1869-1870, were profoundly influenced by their experiences. Another traveler, Muhammad as-Safar, dispatched to France by the Sultan of Morocco in 1845 to 46, returned to write. So it went until all had passed, leaving our hearts consumed with the fire from what we had seen of their overwhelming power and mastery, their preparations and good training, their putting everything in its proper place, in comparison with the weakness of Islam, the dissipation of its strength, and the disrupted condition of its people. How confident they are. He went on to attribute the Europeans' strength not to their courage, bravery, or religious zeal, but because of their marvelous organization, their uncanny mastery over affairs, and their strict adherence to the law. The corpus of European thought and intellectual and cultural achievement, particularly in its then contemporary form, was another source of wonder for the apprehensive Muslims of the time. A great deal of biases of the early Orientalists, for example, their focus on the classical age of Islam and in particular on Baghdad of the Abbasids, was internalized by the reformers when examining weaknesses in their own society. Islam was seen to have peaked by the end of the 12th century and had been in regress ever since. This encouraged an attitude which minimized or trivialized the achievements of Islamic civilization since that period, partly because what came after was no longer centered on the imaginary Arab heart. The post-Abbasid world of Islam was deemed unworthy of comparison to the high culture and of the classical period. The race was afoot to find out the culprits behind the decline of the Muslims and their power. This, in so many words, was the stereotypical response of the cultivated Muslims to the Europe of the 19th century. This bedazzlement often bred a sense of inferiority, in particular if the material and cultural gaps with Europe loomed so large as to appear fearsomely daunting. It was far easier to assume the superiority of European modernity over Islamic obscurantism and effectively to abandon all possibilities of revitalizing Islamic civilization. Many would eventually choose this route. New industrial age. The decline in self-confidence accelerated as Muslims lost certainty that comes from adhering to the unique vision of the world which their civilization offered. The understanding of fundamentals of perception, such as the nature of the self and the physical world, the ordering of personal relationships, the meanings and legitimacy of authority, the organization of society, or even the basics of existence, such as man's ordering of space and time, changed in essential ways. The Islamic worldview was in most ways different from and often antithetical to that of modernity. No civilization had to undergo the rapidity and scope of change that the world of Islam experienced in its tumultuous and incomplete transition to the modern. The transition which the West experienced during the 18th and 19th century from the agrarian order to the industrial age was turbulent enough but was nevertheless conducted within the framework of the civilization itself. Enclosures of agricultural common lands were not forced by a foreign power. The design and manufacture of machines were not imported from an alien world. The factory system and the regimented labor force was not transported from elsewhere. The modern industrial age may have started in a small corner of northwestern Europe and New England, but it was connected in a fundamental sense with the legacy of the broader civilization of the West and could not probably have arisen in a similar form anywhere else. At the same time, it could not have taken shape outside the political and legal framework of the nation state and the attendant structures and institutions which evolved alongside the Industrial Revolution. The change in perspective, in skills, and in disciplines which were required of the average Europeans or Americans in order for them to adjust to the needs of the age of machines and mass markets were jarring but not completely alien. In Islam, they were catastrophically new. Islam was a civilization preeminently mercantile. The establishment, access, and control over trade routes formed a key feature of the economy of Islam. This was at its base an agrarian world, but it relied on its merchants and traders to move the surpluses and the products of a highly skilled urban crafts culture over a far reaching area. The geographical space of Islam was by far the widest known to man before the advent of the empires of Europe. It stretched right across the Eurasian landmass and into Africa, forming a distinct religious and cultural community, even though it was divided into different political states. Within the constraints of pre-modern travel, geographic mobility was widespread. Merchants and traders sought markets, but the notion that economic life should be built around the demands of impersonal market forces was alien to Islam. The Islamic polity did not organize its affairs so that the factors of production of land, labor, and capital were traded as commodities. Neither did it adapt its laws, the multivariate Sharia law, to accommodate the needs of the organized capitalism and financial intermediation. Sharia law was, if anything, a set of contractual principles which covered some aspects of personal and social relations. Marriage, for example, had no sacramental status, and the stigma of illegitimacy did not attach to the offspring of legally contracted secondary partners. A great deal was left out of Sharia law, leaving a large range of activities to be governed according to the interests of the contracting parties. At the same time, Sharia law paid little attention to either ascribe or acquire status. Unlike in Europe, aristocracy simply did not exist as an enduring class based on hereditary land ownership. There were large and often powerful landowners, but the Talukdars and Zamindars of North India or the Turco-Circassian Pashas of Egypt did not constitute feudal aristocracy. Time was not measured in the daily work norm of the industrial West, but by the times of prayers. You did not meet someone after lunch, but after the midday prayers. The craftsmen's hours were not measured by the mechanical clock of the factory worker. The members of the craft guilds, the Asnaf in Persia or Harafiyun in the Arabic-speaking world, ordered their day by a mixture of intricately skilled work and regular worship. Their workday started with the spiritual exercises and calisthenics and paeans to the spiritual nights of Islam. The Japanese and Koreans had similar traditional practices, but rather than abandoning them, they modernized them. The workday in some major Asian corporations still begins with a song or hymn to the glories of work and the corporation. But the ingredients for producing a uniquely Islamic entry into the modern times, building on the main aspects of Islam's historical legacy escaped its leaders and elites as they grappled with the prospects of being overwhelmed by European powers and technology, making nations and races. The fracturing of the Islamic world's unity led to a proliferation of successor ideologies vying for and redefining people's loyalties and identities. Nearly all of them were derived from European ideas or institutions. Probably the most enduring of the modern transplants into Islam was the idea of the nation state. Wherever colonial rule operated, the organization of the conquered territory followed the pattern of a European nation state. The historical empires of Islam that survived into the 20th century followed suit, even though in an incomplete form. The process, of course, was finalized after the First World War when the Ottoman Empire was recast as a number of nation states and the Iranian state reconstituted itself as the Pahlavi dynasty. The nation state was an entirely alien concept in Islamic political theory and practice. Dynasties drawn from particular ethnic or linguistic groups were common in Islam, but the idea of a nation in the European sense was utterly remote from its legacy. The classic 19th century definition of the nation was the one proposed by Ernest Renan in his tract What is a Nation? Renan may appear now as an antiquated figure, part of the Victorian era parade of philologists, political and economic theorists, and philosophers who dealt with grand themes and schemes. He is now best known for his controversial work, The Life of Jesus, in which he sought to reinterpret scriptures in the light of modern standards of critical historiography. Renan sacralized the nation by giving it a soul, the precursor of Elan vital, which was the stock trade of all 20th century nationalisms, not least of the invented nationalisms of states built out of wreckage of the Ottoman Empire and the dissolution of the colonial system. A nation is a soul, a spiritual principle, a large aggregate of men healthy in mind and warm in heart, creates the kind of moral conscience which we call a nation. So long as this moral conscience gives proof of its strength by the sacrifices which demand the abdication of the individual to the advantage of the community, it is legitimate and has the right to exist. The community takes precedence over the individual and defines the worth of the system. This was the common refrain of the earlier nationalists of the post-Islamic order who sought to recognize their societies on what they believed were the foundations of a successful Western model. Nationalists' thought was almost by definition secular and appealed to the intellectuals of the period who had despaired of or refused to contemplate the reform of Islamic political institutions. Religion, to the 19th century mind of Renan, was simply an extension of the human imagination and did not have an independent existence as such. The work of Orientalists simply reinforced the process of building on the nation state and on the ideology of nationalism, regarded as the successor to Ecumenical Universe of Islamic Civilization. Research on the languages of Islam, on the ethnic history of Turks, Arabs, Persians, and Malays, and on literary legacies of these groups was the foundation of Oriental studies in Western universities. The first generation of Muslims who had been influenced by the Western scholarship and scholars on Islam, nationalism, secularism, utilitarianism, and other doctrines of the 19th century, provided the first glimmerings of an ethnically based nationalism. Islamic political theory and practice had no place for nation state. The adoption of the nation state as the replacement for Islamic polity required the invention of new words and concepts. There was no word in any of the languages of Islam that would parallel the meanings of the nation and nationalism. Such meanings had to be contrived from other words which did not convey the same meanings. meanings. At the same time, the territorial sense of nation as something confined within the strict geopolitical space where a common ethnicity prevailed had never took root in Islamic political culture. Once again, the idea had to be applied awkwardly using terms which did not quite fit the European meaning. There were different words for the territorial space that Muslims inhabited, such as Watan, Bilad, Earth, but none carried the distinct modern sense of the word nation. Appropriating the word Ummah, the Quranic term for the community of believers, to denote the idea of a nation was effectively an attempt to desacralize a term which was commonly understood by Muslims but obviously with a different meaning. The idea of an Arab nation or Turk nation embraced people who lived across a huge geographic area and were divided along numerous political states. It became more difficult to reconcile the notion of loyalty to a homogeneous nation or ethnic group with the principles of loyalty to the Islamic Ummah, which transcended ethnicity and linguistic barriers. Race was also substituted for religion with even less conviction. Europeans were stressing the supposed genius or uniqueness of particular racial groups, and this was absorbed by those who sought an alternative level of certainty and identity to the one provided by Islam. Turks, Arabs, and Persians were all encouraged to reach back into their past in order to evolve a narrative of glory and destiny that could provide a basis for renewal in the world order, which was supposedly replacing Islam. The Quranic treatment of race was represented purely in terms of a group's adherence to the covenant with God. Whenever or wherever one group was singled out for preference, it was invariably in terms of its fidelity to the spiritual and ethical norms required of it. You were the best of mankind, enjoining what is good and eschewing the forbidden, the Quran said. There is, of course, no denying that race was an element in the dynamics of Islamic civilization, as seen in the cultural wars of Shurubiyya, where the Arabs were pitted against the Persians, or in the latter part, the Ottoman Empire, where Arab was a derogatory term used by the Turkish officialdom, implying uncivilized or uncouth. The Arabs, in turn, would take inordinate pride in their language and in the fact that Islamic message was in Arabic and was carried at first by the Arabs. The ideologues of Arab nationalism frequently descended into race-based exaltation of the Arab Charter, but their constructs were hardly original. Their drawings from the 19th century European thinkers were obvious. The systemization of archaeology in the 19th century has opened another avenue into the past for those seeking to refashion the loyalties of Muslims towards a non-Islamic or even pre-Islamic world. The uncovering of histories of Babylon, the pharaonic dynasties of Egypt, Persepolis, the Phoenicians, and even the Mediterranean as a cultural and civilization unit were all used in one form or another to relate to a remote past with which Muslims, at least those of the Middle East, had little or no popular resonance. Nevertheless, these histories still featured prominently in the attempts to refashion identity, especially in the countries of the Levant and Egypt. Liberalism and extreme secularism represented another aspect of some of the systems that sought to replace the world defined by the precepts of Islam. The clearest case of this was in the drive of Mustafa Kemal to transform the newly established nation state of Turkey along pronounced secular and westernizing lines. But the Turkish experiment was not duplicated in such sweeping and determined terms in other Muslim countries. Aspects of Turkish reforms were tried in a number of Muslim countries, but their effects were muddled and shallow. In Egypt, the political and cultural elite was not prepared or willing to jettison the entire legacy of Islam at one fell swoop. as the new leaders of Turkey had done. Nevertheless, Egyptian public policy was couched in secular terms. To some extent, the liberalism of 19th century in Europe reconstituted itself on the banks of the Nile. Parliamentary institutions were patterned after Westminster. Following the lead of Britain, the paramount power in Egypt during the first half of the 20th century, the cultural preeminence of Egypt was unquestioned in the interwar years, not only among the Arabic speaking people. The Cairo of the 1920s and 1930s was a ferment of literary and artistic experimentations which drew on modernity for their inspiration. But unlike in Turkey, these currents parted ways with, rather than rejected, the Islamic legacy. There was also considerable Islamic intellectual activity during this period. For example, the proselytizing of the Salafist strain in Islam emanated from Egypt, where Rashid Rida's Al Manar newspaper was published, and Egypt featured one way or another in the projects to revive the caliphate and the various pan-Islamic ventures of the time. However, it was the towering intellectual figure of Taha Hussein 1889 to 1973 in Egypt and the controversies he engendered that were characteristic of the period immediately following the end of the First World War. It was left to Taha Hussein and his supporters and detractors to confront the issue of a national identity and purpose by framing it along a significantly different basis to that of Islam. The effects of these conflicts resonated throughout the Muslim world. Taha Hussein's childhood, memorably and movingly described in his autobiography Al Ayyam, The Days, was one of hardship and struggle, made even more difficult by blindness inflicted on him by an incompetent village barber who was treating him for a common eye infection. He rose through the traditional school system, which led him to great religious institutions of the Al Azhar University. Then he moved on to the recently established Cairo University. He continued in France, where he received a doctorate from the Sorbonne. His writings were voluminous, comprising nearly 60 works, not all of them memorable, but he remained committed to the thesis of Egypt's essential westernness, which he elaborated upon in his work Mustaqbal al-Saqafa fil Misr, The Future of Culture in Egypt. In outline, his argument was that Islamic civilization was based on the willingness of the early Muslims to borrow freely from the advanced world of the Persians and the Byzantines, and that Egypt should similarly borrow freely from the modern European world. At the same time, Egypt's integration into the West was, in important ways, a homecoming. Egypt, Taha Hussein contended, was always a part of the West rather than of the Orient. Its geographical position, its Mediterranean culture, Pharaonic, Ptolemaic, Roman, and Byzantine pasts have all positioned the country firmly in the West. To this must be added the historical legacy which connected the Egyptians' mind with that of the ancient Greeks, turning Alexandria into a citadel of Greek philosophers. All of this, he wrote, points out in these modern times that we should be connected with Europe by bonds that strengthen daily until we merge into Europe in meaning, form, and reality. And we will not find this onerous, as the Egyptian mind is not different in its essence and nature from the European mind. In retrospect, the position of Taha Hussein might appear hopelessly disconnected from reality, but it had a profound effect on the country's elites as it provided them with the intellectual justification to ape European ways and customs. This was the age when the ruling classes sent their children to British-style boarding schools, joined country clubs, and held literary soirees, spoke at least two European languages, watched risque films, attended the Cairo Opera, and read the first of the proliferating women's magazines. Where Egypt led In those days, other countries followed, including the ruling groups of the Arab states of the Near East. The distancing from the world of Islam accelerated a scant 2 decades after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The intellectual climate of the time, which continued at least into the 1960s, was anchored in an open acknowledgement of the superiority of modern civilization based on technology. This was exclusively identified in the West as the first, and then for a short period with the Soviet bloc as the perspectives associated with Taha Hussein's overt orientation towards the West became tempered partly by the anti colonial struggle that was continuing in various parts of the Muslim world.